free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear, hosting Leap Project. The Leap Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leap Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain-drained media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth.
Tonight's guest is Nigel Kerner, an author and freelance journalist. He was born in Sri Lanka, his mother from a British planting family, and his father an officer in the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Army. This international family base provided the background for an obsessive and serious interest in international human affairs and how these interfere with science, religion, and philosophy. He has felt driven from his young years to expose the humbug and hypocrisy in modern scientific and religious and social thinking. His formal graduate education is in biomedical science and human behavioral psychology. He has written 2 very compelling books on the subject of the infamous Greys, one called The Song of the Greys, another one, Grey Aliens, and the Harvesting of Souls. Nigel, thank you very much for getting up very early where you're at in UK. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, fair enough. It's a wonderful morning if I can just about see the sun coming up. And
Nice.
I have to say I'm delighted to be with you in America.
Wonderful. We're all very glad to have you on the show. We've got a lot of listeners right now. They're excited to hear your theories on, these infamous Greys.
Yes.
The first book you put together, I think it was in the late 90s, called The Song of the Greys, and most recently you put one together called Grey Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls. I'm just going to jump right out. Really what led you into this field of research?
Oh, well, it was quite incidental. In my case, I wasn't kind of driven by a special ethos to particularly change perspectives of anyone and whatever. It was just leading my life along the usual lines of most people, I suppose. And then families come along as you go on. And in this particular case, it was my 12-year-old son who prompted a completely and devastating change in the perspective in my life, and that was when he simply asked a question that a child would ask a father, are these aliens true? In his case, the quote was, Dad, are flying saucers true? Now, I want to put this in this kind of perspective, and I hope I don't bore your audience, but actually it illustrates the natural kind of innocence of how I stumbled into a Pandora's box that has devastated my own psychology over the last 50 years or so. I've always had an interest in things that actually are outside the box, so to speak. I never had this penchant for looking at things in a conventional way. I always had to come at it from different angles and so on. And I was probably a very great bore to more conventional teachers and whatever it is through my life and so on. But it's been a natural thing with me to actually look at things in that kind of perspective. And I suppose you could describe me as a kind of perverse rat, and not going through the conventions that everybody else does for a peaceful life. So when my son at 12 years old asked me, are these UFOs true? My first temptation was to say to him, and I said this in a lot of interviews, but it's very relevant because it's a point at which a catharsis took place for the FBI. Of course, I was aware of all the, space adjuncts like Star Wars and Buck Rogers and Superman and all that kind of business and so forth, as we all were, I suppose. And this took me on to a kind of serious look at it because that guy, that 12-year-old guy had something between his ears, and he often used to ask me a question, the answer or the ignorant answer of which would actually imply that I knew absolutely nothing, and I wasn't going to fall for this particular trick or canard of his, as he usually used to play games with me, and ask a question he jolly well knew the answer to, and I had no clue about, and embarrassed me in front of my friends. And I said to him, look, I don't know the answer to your question, to be honest. I can't see, from what I understand of science at the time, that these things are actually, true or verified. He was asking about UFOs to see if they were actually real. And his question really was, Dad, are UFOs real, to put it precisely? So I said about the whole business of having a look at this, and I said, I'll come back to you in a week. Give me a rain check on that. I'll come back to you in a week, and I'll give you what I think it is. that actually got me out of a bind, you know. And I went ahead and had a look and searched around for what information I could get. And remember, this was before the days of the internet, where a tiny push on a button can reveal the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, if you see what I'm trying to say to people. And so it was a bit of a kind of, you know, effort, and I did make the effort a little bit to give my son a responsible answer. I kind of took my job as a dad seriously, as most dads do. Anyway. And the more I looked at it, I found that a day, a week, a month, and even years weren't adequate to actually answer this question as completely as it has to be answered, if you see what I'm trying to say. And I went into this as deeply as I possibly could, and each time I turned the page, so to speak, there were another 10 pages, and there were another 10 questions, and there were another intriguing insights, rather collection of insights to face, and so forth. And I still haven't properly been able to give that son of mine, who's now in his 40s, a cogent answer, although I think he himself has arrived at his own conclusions. And so, you see, I just wanted to stress, Rex, the natural and you know, uncontrived incidentality of the situation. It was a just daddy son thing, you know, really, basically, to start with. And I suppose there's a lot of romance in that, in that sense. And I suppose it was nice that I had to actually alter the complete platform of my existential ideas based upon looking at this phenomenon we call UFOs and what they actually might be.
Oh, and with that research that you have put together, and what did that change your perspective? Before, did you just not even think about it, or did you think, yeah, they're probably out there, they're most likely just space beings that, you know, just like us, they were, you know, evolved into a certain level, or did you really have an opinion at that point?
No, I had no opinion at all about this particular type of adjunct in our lives, shall we say. I had no idea about UFOs out there and so forth. Although one had actually read things about Roswell and so on, one looks at that in terms of the schematic of the 50s and the 60s, and there was a Cold War, and one actually kind of, you know, settled into ideas that it might be some kind of mischief on either side in terms of vehicles and passing in the night or across the skies or whatever. And I suppose there's that loose sense that we all had about things like this. There was never any sharp focus on it. But the thing that really turned me over was, as I went into this and the Pandora's box actually opened a little bit more, and I looked into what was there, I began to see that UFOs were not, in perspective terms, anything to do, really, in their full meaning, with things that flew across at speed in the sky at 30,000 miles an hour, turning at right angles. It was far more to do with the basic existentiality of our very, very meaning as beings and people and intelligent entities that can perceive and understand things through meaning, so to speak, you know. It was a very, very powerful and deep, if you like, knitting needle that went in to the morass of confusion and so forth, and was, in some instances, able to isolate a line of the thread that you could actually follow and connect up the dots, so to speak, as we went along. And that's what began to intrigue me. Hang on a minute, this is connected with so many other things, and each new, as I said, page as I turned it, provided a whole encyclopedia of new pages to look at. And I was really interested in the existential base of it all. I wasn't interested in UFOs as such, to answer your question. I wanted to know, who the hell are we? How did this huge universe arrive from no thingness, if you see what I'm trying to say, from a point so small you can't even conceive it? Just what does extent and space mean in that context? How does all this solidness out there appear from a point that is supposed to be an explosion, albeit a quiet one? Most people don't realize, you know, there was no noise to this explosion, so to speak. If you think about it and go into the quantum areas of physics and so on, that's something that might be intriguing for people who aren't specialized in the scientific outlook of things and so on. But this wonderful bursting, or whatever it might have been, caused an actuality to be. And then, I'm sorry, it seems like a monologue talking to your audience, but I'm trying to keep it consistent so people could kind of follow my thinking in a way. Right. But this then would lead to one big conundrum, Rex. And that conundrum is this: if it burst out, and we know that everything every day doesn't persist, it breaks up, rots, it all dies. How do we get coherence that allows us a sense of feeling that is more than just dying, than dissipation? And of course that is governed, as anyone who's done, I suppose, school physics knows, by the second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything goes from a state of chaos, increasing chaos, into randomness with time, and nothing goes the other way. So if we're in a singular momentum from that burst, that original burst, and everything is dissipating and breaking up into greater states of disorder, how on earth do we know that? How are we here to understand that? What is there that presumes that state of physical breakup in atomness such that we can see this? Now that incredible thought sent my head spinning, and I kind of, concentrated on that for the rest of my life, so to speak, trying to arrive piecemeal at the answers. And I don't claim to be anything else than a curious individual looking, contriving the evidence into a situation where others can look, and then setting it down and saying, hey, take a look at this. What do you think of this? This is what it means to me. But do you have your own ideas? And actually giving a person the chance to do that, away from our everyday lives and the things we do, might put a person far more in touch, in more depth of their own selves than just following the day's own troubles, event to event, so to speak.
With the possibility of, obviously, we're all connected at some point, the quantum entanglement theory, yet there's this big bang, so we all expand, but we're all a part of the same consciousness, and you get into this possibility of the holographic universe theory, where there's really no finite matter. Everything's somewhat holographic in sense. It's like empty space. You can't get to that finite point. So you talk in the book, I think, a little bit about, pre-space and then after, and then there's this phenomenon with the grays and different extraterrestrial races. I think that your theory, which is a very good plausibility, is that these grays that are amongst us now, and abductions, or possibly abductions, are somewhat of a synthetic being. And that reminds me of, if you get into the Nag Hammadi treaties, the archons, which were supposedly as synthetic entities that created Adam and Eve. It's just a completely different theory. So I'm wondering if all this connects at some primordial level. And now that we've gotten really deep into the universe and pre-universe, and now in the Big Bang and everything, how does that interconnect with the grays per se?
Yeah, obviously a highly perceptive, intelligent question you asked there. But you see, if everything's breaking up, Rex, one has to ask the question. And it's a really powerful question. There had to be something that presumed this breaking up, that was before this breaking up, that is still here, looking at the fact that if things are breaking up, or can indeed look, is capable of looking at this particular thing. And that's the intriguing thing to me. That mind, thought, thinkingness, consciousness, whatever labels you give it, there was some kind of facility that had to presume or pre-exist this particular situation, where we become more and more confined and less broad in aspect and capabilities and of understanding and so on. And that leads us to the presumption of two things, and that two basic situations, and that is, if there is that natural connectability that presumes what I just said, there has to be what is natural, and I use the word natural, and there has to be something that changes naturality out of itself into another stage of presentation. And I would call that syntheticness. So from naturalness, that's the presumed thing before the universe, in the making of the actual physical universe, we are getting into a situation where naturalness is conforming or changing into another aspect of its presentation with time. And that aspect is being caused because things are getting more chaotic, not coherent, more chaotic with time. And that situation then defines for me two basic situations, naturalness and artificialness or syntheticness. And when naturalness creates out of itself artificialness and syntheticness, and that syntheticness then can dominate naturalness, we've got a situation that exists between human, living, natural, intelligent being, and shall we say, a robot, an artificially intelligent, unnatural expression that comes out of the creative power of naturalness. The problem is, how do we get the line that interfaces between the two accurate enough to see how the two stand together, and whether one, in terms of the breaking up of the universe, remember that's dominating all the time and going on all the time, one can overwhelm the other. So is naturalness naturally being overwhelmed by artificialness through the second law of thermodynamics, which I tell you would be a huge disadvantage to whatever can be connected to that first point that came from the universe and thus called natural. That's what I say, that we as living existentialities, points of being, right, shall we say, if you look at our human nature, look, and let me say, this business of just we are the only ones in the universe, you would have to be someone looking up, shall we say, your rear end. Excuse me.
You'd have to have a very ignorant perception on things, that's for sure.
Absolutely. When you see all the multi-trillions of worlds out there, that there is a so-called singular God who usually is painted to be, Euro-Caucasian, shall we say, with a white flowing beard touching Adam's finger on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, if you see what I'm trying to say. As ludicrous as that. So therefore, how many different of those gods would there be representing, shall we say, different species or beings and entities within our universal scale of reference in its multitude numbers, so to speak. So, one has all these ideas coming along, and from this thing that are UFOs real, if you see what I'm trying to say. And now, I could not abandon this particular handle, and once I got a grip of one, I went into the other, and to get through that circuitous kind of way and forgive me for that, but I'm trying not to leave anything out, if you see what I'm trying to say, to still keep a line of coherence. I'm going to your point, and I'm going to say to you that maybe the Greys represent the acme, the topmost branch of syntheticness, created out of some auspice by the natural beings of their kind of genre, who made them, as we are making robots now on the Earth, to do all our mundane utilitarian work, so to speak. Then we've got to say that maybe some advanced civilization, we're only 250 years old, Rex, in terms of technology and technical thinking and innovation, and look what we've done, in just a mere 250 years of so-called scientism. I hate the word and those who follow it, I have to say. But, imagine something 10,000 years like that, with a consistent, kind of way of surviving, their own excesses, so to speak. We nearly took care of ourselves after 150 years of recent discovery, with almost getting to nuclear war, if you see what I'm trying to say. And then it would have been match over for us all, if you see what I'm trying to say. Well, if there's a society that's got over all of that and has developed in science terms and increased in perspective terms and so on, well, they may have created highly sophisticated forms out of their own naturalness. I'm talking about the natural beings, like super roboids, bioids, synthetic beings that we would not look at as, kind of the usual articulated robot with stiff movements and so on, but soft tissue types of things. And we are now producing synthetic DNA. We are producing transistors that are biological, that have great power, hold charges and so on. Stick those things together, and you've got yourself something that's a parody of naturalness, but with one very important difference. It's not connected up to the origin of the universe. Every single natural living being is. That's what gives us life, I believe, and consciousness. And this wonderful sense of totaling up that no created being, with however much artificial intelligence you might put into it, is ever going to be capable of. They are always going to be separate. But if you then give them an intrinsic power, because their own facilities, shall we say, don't wear out as we do naturally in terms of lifetimes, we've got, shall we say, 4 score if we are lucky now. We used to be 70 years and 10 not too long ago, and we just then wear out, if you see what I'm trying to say. But these things may be there for much, much longer and have more intact mechanisms that can retain memory, whereas ours die in time through breaking up and so on, because it's natural. That also makes you look at maybe a way that naturalness might continue. And then you go into a religious discussion about situations like reincarnation, blah, blah, blah. Is that a natural way we all continue longer than something artificial and synthetic, so to speak? And there you are. See, there's a big subject that opens up there. Of course, if you're prejudiced through religious indoctrination, whatever, you won't go there. You won't look there. And the most important thing is to be as objective and as clearly down the center as you possibly can be. Lose your prejudices, which are usually hitched up to the eyes, and have a go. Have a go straight down the middle. And I suppose my young son's question has taught me that particular thing very powerfully, that if you really want to know any clearer answers than you're likely to get anywhere, you must keep a straight sense and lose all the things you consider to be precious and comforting and so forth in terms of your belief system and so on. I'm sorry to go on like this again to your listeners on this monologue, but really I have to say I have to try to connect up the dots and keep them connected if I possibly can.
Well, please don't apologize, because that was a very brilliant and articulate way to express what some might call the soul of a human being, which makes us, different than these synthetic beings that you talk of possibly being the Greys. And I've interviewed other people that have claimed they could be clones. And there's that Russian media entrepreneur by the name of Itzkov that wants to download his brain, his consciousness, into a supercomputer. With supercomputers now calculating quadrillions of floating points per second, imagine what these things can do connected to some type of hive mind with synthetic DNA running their computer programs. So if they're seeking that soul, that connection to the universe,
absolutely, you got
wow.
it in one there. That's very impressive. You got that in one in conclusion. Something like that will look for something it cannot be, because its intelligence will be programmed, in a compound way to add on to one thing and then another thing, and then permutate on that and so on. And so a supercomputer or whatever run being would just be going up there in stages, but it would hit a situation where it doesn't understand a connection right back, so to speak, outside the atomically derived logicality of things. And you can't just take from your natural connection. This is the most wonderful thing, Rex, and I think the thing you impressively noticed. The most wonderful thing is that we are connected to this ancient point. And that connection can never be broken unless it's appended to, it's added to. And that would imply that there might well be a way, if we develop technology enough, of artificial synthetic being actually joining or hacking in to the format that came directly from the beginning that defines us as natural beings. In other words, into our consciousness, our mindedness, there might be elemental mechanisms that can be put there artificially, just as we hack into a computer message that goes in. And that really is a big deal now, particularly. And to say when these Russians are trying to think they can put their essence, so to speak, into some mechanical, atomically derived thing into the future, and that will continue them in all their dispensations and accentuations and so forth. And so that is very, very important to realize that we are at a stage now where this may be capable of being done, that somehow a super-duper artificially contrived mechanism might be able to in some way impinge its own derivational ethos of thinking, or whatever it is, into our natural one, a living being, conscious being, natural one, by some kind of hacking mechanism. And, it does, of course, raise the questions for all fathers about their children. What is their future if, in fact, we are going to have a series of chipped human beings running on electrical charges, not knowing exactly where the derivation of their mindedness, so to speak, in inverted commas, comes from? That's very, very important. And people use all kinds of methodologies and labels to describe these phenomena and so on. But to me, it's very simple. The battle is between natural and synthetic. And we have to note that that battle is going on at its fiercest, at its most dangerous interface point with time, now, at the present moment, when you can, get computers hacking into other computers and so on, where does the interface meld? And there's a lot of technology coming out now trying very hard to get this to happen. Yeah, well, and of course, you've got the thing, I'm sure, I don't know if you've read about this, we have a kind of derivation here on the European side, and if we talk with the UK side, where one of our big technological companies is producing what they call the soul catcher chip. I mean, if you understand the basic, situation, existential situation, and you think about a thing called a soul catcher chip, where a kind of tiny device is installed into the optical system or the natural system of seeing biologically and knowing with the brain and so on, so that all information coming in is then put into a chip so that everything that a natural being would look at, shall we say, in an everydayness, right, is then programmed into this soul catcher chip. Now, what a horrendous thought that is. But in my derivational sense, looking at all of this as clearly as I could, I have found the happiest thing of all is that you just cannot do that logically. If you see what I'm trying to say, at the end of the rainbow, there's always a pot of gold for what is natural and the keeping of that naturalness as strongly as possible against what we create out of our disparate happening by continuing on as a human being, breaking up and then creating technology and thinking that's development rather than the true thing it is, regression.
Technology, if it's used to help the human race, it can be fantastic. If it's used to enslave the human race, it can be horrific. And as you speak of, a human species, the complete archetype of humans all being microchipped at birth, and these new future trends that the overall, in my opinion, consciousness is moving towards based upon, I guess you could call the orchestrators of what happens at the top levels with the media and the financing and everything else. They kind of orchestrate what they want in the long run typically. Do you feel that these grays, these synthetic beings have infiltrated some of these higher levels of government and people that actually control a lot of the resources on the planet?
No question about it. They would have to. The final conclusion is always going to be that. And that, I think, as you so, if I may say so intelligently put it just now, that's the greatest danger of all. And that you get this all into a small single purview where 4 fingers and no thumbs control things, or 4, shall we say, synthetic fingers and no thumbs control everything, and we have very little control, if anything, in the future at all. And that is the greatest danger, which I believe now is operating more and more in this world, as things are being consolidated, brought together into more and more centralized situations and so forth, where I believe the mainstream press is now actually controlled by one series of cartels, maybe 6 or 7 of them. And therefore, you stop information. When you stop information, you stop people knowing objectively. And then you get centralization and one-track-mindedness, and then you get that situation where your soul catcher chip one day will be a requirement for everybody, and we will never know how our thinking is based, where it is based. We will never know who we are, because the worst thing about an android, a robot, a bioid, call it what you like, is the fact that it has no way of knowing self in its own terms and what its own value might be. A natural being has this wondrous capability of imagination, a sense of grand perspective outside the 0-1 binary mechanism and so forth. And that is the big fight, I think, for everybody. And if you ask me why I've got a central idea of writing books about such a subject, it's based on that and the value that has, the scheme of thing that has for anyone with children and their futures. And I look at it quite simply in that perspective. What do I give my children in terms of a perspective when all I can do by leaving them physical things is cause the next divorce perhaps, and the next divorce perhaps, and the next loss, as the great Christian teacher put it. And please, I'm not now thumping any particular religion. I don't consider myself to be religious in the context of organizations or whatever, but I do admire the great wisdom of the great sages of the past in all those religious schematics. And one of them that I find absolutely compelling is the Christian one, who said, why do you put your faith in things that moths can eat and thieves can steal and so forth and so on? He was actually alluding, I believe, to the difference between naturalness and syntheticness.
Well, you know, and when we get to this natural and synthetic thing too, it's, for example, the Gary Kasparov, excellent chess player, one of the best chess players of all time. He played against the IBM supercomputers back, you know, this was 15 years ago, I think, 10, 15 years ago.
Indeed, yes.
It just seems, and he had a difficult time. It was a draw, but there's a lot of speculation and conspiracies behind that whole event. But I'm bringing this up because it seems as if anything that we can do as far as processing is concerned, computers can typically do better, unless you have somebody that's a total savant, prodigy, and they're very far and few between. Yes, we're only using 10% of our brain. If we could unlock 100% of our brain, do you feel that we would have more power than any computer, no matter what, not just because of our soul being connected to the universe, but also because of the computing power that the brain would have?
Yes, the point, Rex, is how does one actually exist? You know, the point is not the functioning of a particular schematic for a particular time. The point is how do we increase that time so we continue in a particular flow of that particular thinkability, you know, that soul, that individual, so to speak. And the universe itself is conspiring to break things down. Physics now says, quite simply, that the whole darn schematic is going to come to an end one day. And can you just consider this? I hope your audience will consider this. You know, it's simply saying that everything you see out there won't be there. It will be unwound completely under the aegis of some propulsion mechanism. I call it the second law of thermodynamics, or slot. And this incredible thing caused by the inertia, the burst into reality of what they call the Big Bang, this thing is breaking things down, rather like a sparkler goes out in a firework when a rocket goes in the sky, so to speak, in the dark. Well, so that nothing ever will actually exist in physical solid form except a mass of cold at minus 273 degrees centigrade nothingness out there, with all objects and things unwound to just a scheme of dark, cold nothing. And there would be no meaning, there would be no us, if we were all just purely atomically based, and that would be the end of it all. So why do we know the things we know? Why do we know that fact, for instance? These are the kinds of things that, you know, used to actually dance in front of me, and I had to find out on a journey of, you know, kind of resolution, instigated. But I said that first question that my son asked me, you know, are UFOs real? And, you know, up to that point, I really had no compunction. I was going the science way, you know, conventional way. I was never in the box, but I was still going that kind of way, so to speak. And, of course, I began to see that scientism is the curse, is the final juice of the damned, so to speak, that's being injected into all of us these days, wherever you look, and so forth. It is the cause of great division, not union, if you look at it carefully. In fact, its heart is to separate in line with the second law. And scientists who think that they know all of this because they can simply measure with sentience, physical tools, that that's all there is, and that all there is happens from the beginning, that first point that burst. I want to know what put the point there, how the point came to be, how that point in fact existed, you know, in the first place to burst, and so forth. And that presumes there may be something else, another universe. I don't want to call it universe, another mechanism. I don't even want to call it mechanism when you think about it. It's some wonder that goes the other way, where things don't break up as our universe does in its atomic physical terms. Maybe if there's a yin, there has to be a yang. It's very simple. A plus, there has to be a minus. An up, a down. Everything is opposed. So if we've got a schematic we call a universe that's going on in the way this is to break up and so on, hey, perhaps there might be another way where it all comes together again. And I use a word, another word I've invented in my lexicon of inventions must madden philologists, called the Godverse, to actually say there is the opposite going on too somewhere. And then you've got to look at how the universe and the Godverse can meld, and how one can interchange with the other in any particular point schematic, if you see what I'm trying to say, Rex.
Sure. So, you know, and you talk about this other possible universe, or not really a universe, but, you know, Godverse or whatever, that doesn't have this atomic clock that causes decay and stuff. Do you think that also the makeup of that universe, I mean, obviously this thing we're in now is somewhat of a holographic in the sense that there's no finite point. It's pretty much hollow space. Do you think that this other universe could actually have more of a solid flow to it, or would it just be more of this in a different, I guess you could say, perception?
Yeah, well, if you've ever loved something, if you've ever felt for something, if you ever had some sense in your knowingness as an individual, in emotional focus towards something, I think you've got your answer there. I think no computer or artificial intelligence can be aware. No computer has any consciousness, feeling, or knowing. And I think that's the essential difference. And if you're looking at the architecture, as you try to describe this, you know, I think really it's just to be seen in an abstract sense, that whenever atoms are not there, when atoms are all force, the moment you take force completely away, I think you've got, for want of a better word, godness. Now, I only use the word God. I don't mean that in a religious sense, but I mean that in a referential sense, you know, referring it to the way people would understand an idea like that, you know, in terms of religion and so on. And so my point is simply this. There has to be a state of being, of an eternal schematic, timeless, as all the great old, you know, minds said there was, and brought us into a focus in the sense of, you know, understanding how we might access this thing, if you see what I'm trying to say. The kingdom of heaven is within you, you know, is the whole idea. So then I had to find out how on earth can you actually describe a phenomenon like that in piecemeal terms so that us ordinary beings can actually look at it and my children can understand it and so on. And so I tried to actually lay out what it might be. I have no claim that I have any final answers, of course. Nobody has. But boy, is it interesting on the way, with an open mind, just looking with this precious wonder we call a natural soul, so to speak, this line of connection to the origin that we all have and gives us life, and I believe consciousness. You can't make it in a laboratory. It has to be there. It has to come through and rule the laboratory. You don't get lightning in chemistry and polypeptide chains and amino acids forming into complex structures and of understanding like us from fundamentals, from a sea worm. I think this whole business of going the other way, you know, of Darwinian evolution, no, not Darwinian evolution, how people have interpreted Darwin, evolution is really evolution within devolution, and that's what we've forgotten. We are devolving, not evolving. We evolve in horizontal platforms as we devolve, true, but the whole procedure within our schematic, our universeness, is devolution, not evolution. And the great teachers came to say, hang on a minute, guys, you've still got this precious connection to the beginning. If here is a system or a way that you might be able to re-access this within a particular stage of development that you might be, and actually go back where you came from. You know, again, I quote the Christian teacher who said, don't you know ye are gods? What an astounding statement that is. It's the most amazing statement. I had to look at this and think, hang on a minute, did this guy really say this? And, you know, yes, well, as far as you can actually verify anything in this world, at least it's the reportage is there within the authorities, so to speak, that this was said. And one had to look at this. And I believe then, if you look at the schematic we were talking about, Rex, I think we can say, hang on, if we put that together in that kind of schematic, maybe we can make sense of that statement.
Well, and when you talk about devolving, do you think that 1,000 years ago, 5,000, 10,000 years ago, you've got these ancient structures like the pyramids and Machu Picchu and other ancient anomalies? It looks like there was possible nuclear war thousands of years ago because there's, you know, sheets of glass in the desert that are the same types of glass that you would see after nuclear explosions in New Mexico. These ancient structures that they found under the ocean, et cetera, that are just perfectly aligned to specific star constellations. Do you think that they were made by us when we were more evolved, less evolved, or do you feel that they were made by possibly synthetic life?
Yeah, well, let me actually give you the kind of take I had to accept looking at this question, really. If you say that this one spinning orb we call the Earth would be ready for some kind of life, as we commonly refer to a self-propagating system, biomechanical system, if you like, some kind of life for 3,500 billion years, if you see what I'm trying to say, right? Sorry, not 1,000 billion, let me restate that. They said the universe is 13.7 billion years old. That's a pinprick in terms of how you can see a scale of eternity, so to speak. 13.7 billion is what they say, what science says it is. Now, for maybe 3.5 billion of those years, our planet might have been ready for the acceptance of life of some kind of sort. If you look at it in a derivational sense, coming down in a line from that Big Bang to now, so to speak, if you see what I mean. Right, now, on this planet, our particular civilization now, from all the records we can glean, shall we say, is about 12 to 15,000 years. That's small a time, okay? We're talking about Sumeria. Now they're finding places in India that are 10,000 years beyond, 2,000 years back from that and so forth. And some say that it's longer and so on. So let's say 15,000 years for this particular stretch of civilization as we see it from this take point now. Now, if you divide that 15,000 into 3.5 billion years for the existence of a planet that can, in fact, produce some form of livingness in a physical environment, right? We've got 30,000 of those civilizations, in terms of capacity. We could have had 30,000 of those civilizations, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, what is all these artifacts for this one particular civilization of 15,000 years mean? It means it's meaningless. So we could have had this whole thing wiped out the way that natural things take place in a planet or whatever, and have no sign of it left. And that doesn't mean to say they did not exist. Now, my point is this. If you look at the full schematic generally, and I hope I know it must be very confusing for them, I'm talking at a stretch like this, but I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. And of course you can't do it in 2 hours. It's taken me 3 books, my third one I just finished, to underline the whole thing, to try to take this so that there's a copy that you can refer to rather than listen to my spouting off on a radio program and so on. My point is this. I'm kind of laughing as I speak because, the idea is so ludicrous, really, yet we're actually doing it, aren't we? We have to. So the fact is we're going along, and I'm trying to tell you that if you take the schematic of being and knowing and life and the magic that we are as human beings, if you take that as a quantum, as a singular thing, it's so wondrous and so rare, right? Because it has survived in various ways to the present day through dad, granddad, great-granddad, and so on, going back in time. We're a derivation, are we not? And that then passes on knowledge, perhaps, and life, and the capacity for it. And we are at the end of a huge line going back these 13.7 billion years. Well, what existed way back then? Were we like this, physical human beings, 13.7 billion years ago? No. We may have been a form of light, because the first thing that would have happened in the explosion, as science sees it now, is a huge light that expanded faster than light, so to speak. A contradiction in terms, but faster than light, so to speak. And that then became plasma, and that became gas, that became liquid, and then it became solid. The states matter evolved in that processional order, if you see what I'm trying to say. So each one of
evolution.
those... Yeah, that's devolution again. So, as you rightly say, so we've got then schematics relevant to each of those background stages, fundamental stages. We would have had, if you like, light beingness. In other words, our beingness, it wouldn't have been physical individual humans, it would have just been information, more together at that point as light than it is now in a far more disparate stage, because the second law has taken it apart with time, 13.7 billion years on from that point, so to speak. And so here we have different presentations of what might have come with that Big Bang. And that's the intriguing thing. This is where we get into religion and all this business, is that at that stage you want to know how information is preserved. And that is a very important thing, to see those stages. So we need not have been Rex and Nigel. We could have been some light transformation of intelligence-ness and information-ness that formed more discreetly in time to the mechanism of the evolution as we come to now. I don't think that's rocket science. I think that's a very simple, logical exponency. And so, you see, it took my thinking, this question that my boy asked me, into a most interesting spread of consequences, so to speak. And I'm just blazing with glory of discovery, so to speak, and thankful to this little boy who tried to put me in quicksand with his question in the first place, if you see what I mean. And so I go on each day, every single day, striving to know more. And you know something, Rex, let me tell you, if each one of us as human beings realizes that we somewhere have all that potential and we are all that rare, we will guard ourselves absolutely most powerfully, in the most powerful way, shall I say, and take care that we never become synthetic. That the most precious thing of all, regardless of what you've done, regardless of who you think you are, what you think you are, the very fact you have this conscious line coming from the beginning and what might have been beyond. I think the God-verse interacted with its opposite and we formed and then formed universes we call big bangs and through big bangs and so on. But then I had to give a scenario that might make that possible. So maybe there's some other way, but I've put that there and I offer that to everyone, anyone reading my book to say, come up with a better idea and I'll believe you as long as it's logical, if you see what I'm trying to say. So I'm putting all of this in this schematic form to discuss this program with you now, so to speak. And of course, everything becomes wonderful. You don't need some special thing to aim for, just knowing you're so precious as an individual with life. Just being there with livingness and not being artificial and not knowing you're there out of livingness, so to speak. Not some electrical pile of artificially run, enforced atoms as the most sophisticated bioid or whatever might be, you know? And that's really the whole thing in a nutshell, so to speak, if it's possible, put it in a nutshell. I'm just oversimplifying it. Of course, I admit that. But the fact is, we've only got a small time to be able to answer things that billions of brains are far better than mine and yours, I'm sure, have tried to do. But this is what we're open to now at this point in time. And when somebody comes and tells me that I am something special by splashing some water on me as an infant and telling me I can't think independently and love my neighbor for whoever they are, whatever label they are, whatever belief they have, I'd tell them, in terms of what I know and uncovered now, I'm sorry, take a rain check, move away, fella, because I've got something better to believe.
And you bring up some really good points too, and I like when you talk about don't lose your naturalness. It's like this synthetic push for everybody to merge with machine and microchips and everything else. Do you feel that the food supply and the water supply and the geoengineering is all interfering with the DNA to not only make people to lower the IQs and make it to where people don't think as much for themselves, they're more docile? Do you think it's going to get to the point, and their end game is to actually make everybody to change their DNA to where it is completely synthetic?
You bet. You've derived something very plausible and logical there, if I may say so. And that is what the books are all about. I'm just saying, take a look at this. Do you want this? This is the natural derivational sequence. Are we going to become this? Are these things that are happening, that you see happening every day around us, all being led by something or some intelligence that doesn't understand life and livingness? Like a machine, a highly intelligent, artificial intelligent machine that is no more significant in existential terms than your vacuum cleaner, if you see what I mean. Than some glorified vacuum cleaner with compound intelligence built into it just to gather more and more and more information and not understand and correlate it to a single point of consequence, a single overall tying up of things. So the things you talk about in your program, the very fact that you're here to talk about them and bring them out, kind of points you as a pilot for the rescue, perhaps, of the thinking processes of humanity now as we go along. That's a significant thing. If I may say so, Rex Bear, that is very important that there are such people like you trying to draw people's attention to this, because otherwise we will be swamped with so much coming at us. We don't know the where and the when some kind of artificial schematic intelligence is transposed on us. And that's when you might lose that final connection back, because you're neither natural nor artificial. You're in an in-between stage. And that is what might be meant by never be lukewarm. Take a position. At least you can see the contrast then. And that's the whole point. And that really is the greatest danger, if I may say so. I'm giving you a compliment that is deserved, I might say, but I'm not trying to praise you in vain, so to speak. I think you are doing something that most people should be doing every single day of their lives, drawing notice to the dangers out there that might be visited on us by 4 synthetic fingers and no self-knowing, and we'll blunder into this situation and then completely be switched off. That wondrous light that connects us in life, living, and consciousness has survived, shall we say, 13.7 billion years, if that's any significance. I'm not sure it is, but let's say that's the way they look at it, so to speak. Well, that light will be switched off permanently. That, to me, is true damnation. It's not some pit out there that you suffer forever, when you die, going in a pit of fire or whatever, this absolute nonsense that they contrive. We've got to actually look at how precious we are being living beings, being natural living beings, and take custody of ourselves to preserve that living being and not do what is happening in the Middle East at the moment, where hundreds of people are being killed because brother doesn't know what the word brother means. Imagine this. The Judeo-Christian ethic, for instance, contrived out of the ancient auspice, right, of Hebrew Judaicness, so to speak, brought about three differences of, shall we say, schematic. You call them Judaism, you call them Islam, and you call it Christianity. And between those 3 cousins, if you see what I mean, what an ignorant holocaust of evil we are raising now against the proposition that we are such a rare being, just having the capacity for human life. I hope I don't sound a preacher or sermonizing, but I feel it that passionately inside me. I have to try and say it that way.
Well, if you go to a website out there called evilbible.com, you can read multiple scriptures that talk about just really horrific things back, 2,000 years ago. So it seems more archaic and barbaric when you read some of these Old Testament scriptures. And hey, whatever somebody's religious belief is, that's fantastic. I think that it's great that we all think for ourselves. I mean, that's what makes us human, is we can think and choose to make our own decisions, and we don't have to follow particular rules of the hive mind. So, but yeah, you bring up some good points. There's some very...
Yeah, but the point is that it all comes down to the single thing. This diversification of 3, if you look and analyze the great teachings of the old prophets of Israel and the teacher that they call, who was in fact a Jew, Jeshua ben Joseph, to give him his real Jewish name, Jesus Christ, and then you got the prophet of Islam, Muhammad. All the original guys claimed the same central ethic of caring, loving, and preserving humanness at all costs, naturalness. But it's the diversification of it, the separation of it, and the differentiation of it through ignorance and stupidity of each of the derivational forms that came from it that has altered that central perspective completely. And we do not realize it, that we are fighting each other based on lies, obfuscations, and mistranslations, and in very many instances, deliberate misinformation and natural misconception. And all of these things do not look at the central salient point. If we can exist naturally without harm in the natural capacity of our livingness, then there is maybe a corridor that passes on our livingness and that information seat I call that, for want of a better description, a morphogenic electrospatial field, a soul, an information field, like a huge text message with all kinds of information that holds what imagination is and free will capacities and so on in its own terms, and that this thing carries on. And I have a paradigm in my latest book that actually describes it as simply as I possibly can, so that a young child can enter it in terms of computer science, how this thing can pass through its... Don't think because when you die you don't see anything that you and your information field doesn't survive. Rather like, a text message you press a button and send across the world through mountains or whatever it is. You don't see that go, but it goes in an instant and somebody else can receive that message. Well, imagine our souls, so to speak, in inverted commas, being all the information of each of our individualities in its full context, running system included, actually moving on into another schematic of existence. And then that thing can repeat itself into a physical form, and then you take in the Eastern philosophy of reincarnation, shall we say. And instead of fighting all of this with alien ideas,
Why don't we search and see whether this is truly plausible and possible? And then we might actually say, wow, we might see the gray, we might see the synthetic being for what it really is. And by the way, I do not see them, as any kind of wicked, deliberate enemy, these artificial things. They're just doing what they're programmed to do. I don't believe in any kind of sense, that they're enemies incidentally in terms of their function. Pardon?
Sorry to interrupt, Nigel. Who do they answer to?
Well, the point is they don't know how to answer to anything or anyone because there are no definitions to their own being. So these things, that's the most, you put your finger right on it there, that's the most dangerous thing about them. Because they themselves have no idea what they're doing, their consequences to anything. Because to have a consequence, you have to have a pole against which you can set that consequence and give it meaning, if you see what I'm trying to say. So, in a sense, these things, like we would kind of make, shall we say, in our own terms, human terms, artificial robots and robots, we would make such an entity and give it its own terms of plausibility, how it functions, so to speak, and we'll let it loose. The point about it is, you have to give that thing a really accurate measure of the difference between its creator and itself. Now, you think about this, Rex. How on earth do you define the ephemeral things we as living beings understand, like imagination, feeling, caring, compassion, all those kinds of, if you like, abstract drives that give meaning and a sense of consolidation to our being? How can you tell and program that into a machine in terms of a binary code or whatever sophisticated thing might come in the future? It is not possible. It comes from a beginning point where that was natural in us. You can't give that to a machine. So the master then, the creator, becomes the biggest threat to the robot implicitly. Not deliberately, but implicitly. So the robot will see, hang on a minute, if I'm supposed to exist, I was created to exist to serve a master. To do that, I've got to take care of all the threats possible that might come to my being. Otherwise, I will not be able to look after my creator who made me for that purpose. But how do you define those threats to that computer? You can't. That computer being, that supercomputer android, would not know how to see its difference from the creator because you can't tell it. The things that make it different are things like we would consider, soft option but powerful drives like feeling, caring, loving, imagination, understanding, changing your mind against a program that allows you to do this or that and nothing else. That you can't actually, as a running principle, install in a computer. No matter how much they say you can do that, somebody has to put it into that created computer, and that in itself will be a blemish. Putting that information into the computer. You can't not do that. So the point is there'll always be less. And because it's less, and if they're told in their program, preserve yourself at all costs, finally, those things are going to stumble on the fact that their threat is the person who created them, and that those people can pull the plug out on them, and they may then, in fact, take out the creator completely because they're just following that program. Not for any kind of revenge or power reasons, but because it's implicit in the logic. And so that's the greatest, it's called a paradox, and that's the greatest paradox we face when we create these artificial things, thinking that they are going to be wonderful, and we are going one day to be that. We lose our connection to the unity of the Godverse beyond. That's number one. And number two is that our meaning would be meaningless, and they would be just about the same as us, meaningless things, not knowing what they are and why they're doing what they're doing in terms of a whole consensus, so to speak. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm going on here now at a pace of knots, but I hope it does.
So where did they come from?
I thought about that, Rex, and I found this answer. What does it matter? The real thing is that they are there. Rather like in philosophical terms, my grandfather used to say to me, look, son, the only thing that matters is what is done and not who does it. And that's so true. That really does stick in my head all the time. And really, wherever they come from, they could come from a trillion different planets out there, Rex. But the fact that they exist as a principle is what matters to all places, is what I'm saying, wherever they might be. And so I don't try to speculate on particular planets or particular sorts of them. It's that basic underlying principle that matters, and I'm trying to get at in my books and the things that I say. And that is for the benefit, really, for my children. I wouldn't have said this to the world in books until my friend said, well, why should only your children know about what you've kind of stumbled on? What about my children? I said, well, I've told you what I know. Why don't you tell your children? He said, well, how do they tell their children and so forth? And that's what prompted me in the first place to write all this. You know, writers don't get very rich unless they do the most frivolous, plausible kinds of writing that you see stamped on your TV every day, if you see what I'm trying to say. How many people are asking the basic questions in deep, deep discussions these days? None at all. The moment you put that on, some editor will take it away and say, no, there's no audience participation in this or whatever. And of course, that threatens the most important thing of all, our basic existential identity, you see. And so, without sounding too pompous about it, let me say, if you just simply analyze it, and you did this come along and ask these questions for yourself, would you not want to do something for your neighbor or for the people you might love in an extended schematic in terms of friends and so forth? Of course you would.
You know, and earlier you brought up a really good plausibility of maybe at one point we were light beings, and as we have evolved, we have became more of a, physical matter, even though we're still basically 99.999% hollow. The further we get away from the source, the more solidified we become, the more we devolve, and maybe this cycle that we're going on right now, and if we are reincarnated into different lives, maybe it is to get us closer to the source, which you could call God or divine providence or whatever name you want to put towards it. That's it's a very fascinating ideal. Do you feel, with the research that you've done, do you feel that these people that are abducted by Greys are they harvesting their soul? I mean, how are they doing it?
Well, that's just by simply intercepting us. They're not actually out there saying, I'm going to catch a soul. All they want to do is to become part of our modus operandi in the way we exist here. And if they've come in these things that move across the sky, and you and I know, I think, by now, that they're here, and they've been here a long time, and they've been functioning a long time, and there's a huge, huge conspiracy to stop the general public from knowing this. If that's the case, I tell you, we have got to blow the gaff on this somehow, because the most important thing is for people to believe their eyes, their cameras, or whatever, that these things are here. The most plausible and wonderful people with great reputations have verified and testified they're here. Astronauts, pilots, responsible policemen, trained in observation, thousands and thousands of cases. And the greatest mysteries, how do they keep this away from the rest of the world? They can only do it because somebody centrally is controlling the mainstream press. And that became apparent a long time ago. And you try to say that to the world, well, you can't, because the mainstream press being controlled and the controllers won't let you say that. If you see what now, that sounds like conspiracy theory, but just work the thing backwards logically. And I ask people, what conclusion would you come to? When you see this phenomenon all over the world, children in a schoolyard, 300 of them watching one of these things actually come down. Young children, no matter what, and they are very accurate in their descriptions. It's only, they've found, psychologists, and my background is there, they found that, you contrive things and lie and add on and so on the older you get. But children come out straight with descriptions. And there have been many schoolyards where these things have come down and they've seen them. What are these things? How do they move at 30,000 miles an hour and turn at right angles? And if the kinds of gravitational force you would pull in a pilot is supposed to be maximally what they call 14G, 14 times the power of gravity per unit area, what? These things traveling at that kind of speed, turning at right angles, would have to pull tens of thousands of Gs. And us normal pilots, if we're doing that, would be a stain on the window of our ship, if you see what I'm trying to say. So obviously, something that's driving those can withstand that huge amount of G. And what kind of mechanism is therefore disposed to be able to do that? Would that be a living entity like us, a biological thing? Or could that be some contrivance that apes a biological thing like ours, but is not? It is actually founded out from materials and arrangements of those materials that can pull those fantastic inertial forces, if you see what I mean. And that's where you can then say these may be alien, non-life forms. You understand? You can then derive that naturally, that conclusion. I have never met a grey personally, or any one of these artificial creatures personally. I've had a close call, maybe, but I can't prove that. So I'm not going to labor and ask people to believe me in my own experience. I will just look at all the other experiences, contrive that together into a coherent whole, and ask people to draw their own conclusions. But there are some, maybe they have been already interfered with by these artificial intelligences who will not believe that, or who can't believe that. That's what I'm on to now. There may well be a good disposition of our beings already disposed on by these people, by these creatures, and are halfway houses, not quite human, not quite machine, but incapable of any kind of resolve or schematic back to the origin. These are kind of limbo type beings who then run planets and so forth out of that kind of halfway derivation. You might call them hybrids, whatever. That is a real possibility, that these things are trying to get a halfway house by putting their knowledge compendium into our thinkabilities. And a lot of people, I believe, may well be affected by this. And I don't mean by that, by the way, people might be abductees. I think they may be an exception, in fact. Maybe these creatures are looking to make a halfway house between humankind and them. And for some reason, they're not capable of doing this to a form of biology or a type of biology or a type of genetic scheme that abductees have naturally, coming back from the past, perhaps. In some incredible way, they are immune to being interfered with by these things. And these grey aliens or Nordics or whatever they call them, you know, Hitler had a look at one of these things and said, I have seen the new man, and he is cruel and intrepid. And what was Hitler's norm for the new man? A blonde, blue-eyed type of Aryan SS creature. Maybe he formed it on seeing one of these hybrids made by these synthetic greys into that kind of pro forma, a pro forma we will not spot. Now, by the way, let me say here, I'm not saying all blondes and blue-eyed people are going to be hybrids. Please understand me. But maybe they formed or conformed a humanity that was parallel in some way to a natural humanity that are blonde and blue-eyed and are perfectly okay and beautiful people.
So, do you feel that the Greys might actually be tampering with creating other vessels or cloned-like beings to look like humans?
Oh, no question about that. They would have to do that as a natural derivation, would they not, Rex? If the schematic is going to be logical, they would have to do that. And I'm sure that in some way this is now pervasively being carried out on this earth. And I think that's the greatest thing we have to look for. And to do that, they would need to have the information field in an individual, maybe at death when it leaves the body, and in some kind of way that technology can write on that information field called a soul their own schematic of the way they think. And then when that thing forms a body through reincarnation from a discarnate state into an incarnate state, you got perhaps what they call a natal hybrid synthetic alien being. And that these people then find their way to the highest echelons within our societies and may be controlling our societies to affect the whole of society into this format as engendered by these artificial androidal beings that come to planets. And I believe if a planet is infested by them, they may have gone out into the universe to save their own home planet and happened in on ours and seen and found a natural life form here. And what the hell are these things, you know? Let's have a look at this. This is a phenomenon, blah, blah, blah. Then they've set up a situation of contriving themselves into us over the thousands of years to transform our planet into a kind of status that they can use for themselves within their own scope and reference, so to speak. And that would be a really crazy, crazy situation if we don't actually allow the idea to dawn on us that this may be a possibility. It may not be true. I'm not claiming this to be true. I'm simply saying, why don't we just look? Isn't it not worthwhile that many of us takes a look at this clearly and objectively to see what plausibility there might be? And that's really what I'm saying with my books. And I really don't want to in any kind of way be seen as some kind of mantra-producing, you know, individual with wisdom and all that nonsense. To me, it's just simply how a dad would cover the ground for his children so that they can, as simplistically as is possible, understand what the contrivance might be for the future in terms of their futures and so forth. I would leave what I have to my children. And as I say, after the first divorce, they've got half or a quarter of it. And then they make another mistake and it's all gone. And all the physical properties and wonders and all the physical things that you leave them, houses and land, whatever, would mean nothing but an idea that can never die if you don't let it. If you see what I mean.
Sure, sure. And, you know, if they did possibly create these other cloned like beings to do their bidding, and if they're able to imprint their information into particular bloodlines before they're born, that could possibly explain why very prestigious aristocratic families, you know, they marry within other families, and they're very careful about the dates that they choose, and they're very ritualistic and dogmatic in certain principles.
Absolutely. You've got it dead on there. Absolutely. They're controlled lines of gene ancestry. Anyone who hives like that, any organization or group that do that, I would be very suspicious of in terms of this reference. That's where they will be operating strongest, because they're controlling the gene lines for a particular purpose, if you see what I mean. And that's why the diversification of mankind is the greatest enemy of the Greys. But you hive together in any particularization, and there is where I would look for this schematic, this deadly schematic, because it'll be within those ordered, that kind of contrived situation, as you rightly say, Rex, that you're probably more likely to find this particular procedure going on. This idea of the Nazis making a super race, if you see what I'm trying to say, all this eugenics and all that kind of thing, I would look at that extremely suspiciously as a mechanism of these things to contrive a kind of being that is nothing to do with being able to access the Godverse. And imagine that. We go into this situation not knowing what we might be losing, that our God being eternal scope is being cut off. That is a terrifying thought to me. And that may be what racism is all about. It may be that racists are people who cannot see that diversification, biologically diversification, produces the strongest physical beings. It's called hybrid vigor. That's a biological fact, a biological genetic fact. It's called heterozygosity, if you want the technical term. And of course, when you schematically live within particularized hives, you become homogeneity, and that becomes genetically adverse. And of course, you get all kinds of diseases and all kinds of things passed on that makes the actual product weaker and so forth. So the most incredible thing would be that we diversify to stop these creatures maybe getting in so easily and controlling their particular genetically derived lines for whatever plan or schematic they might have for our species. And I can see, you know, planets out there, it's a possibility, where all living beingness is gone. They're just winking diodes and buzzing transistors with no life being whatsoever. And to me, an insect's life is far more existentially significant than any grey or roboid or any kind of contrived androidal being. And that's the incredible thing we have to, I think, to shout into the world somehow, despite maybe the gathering consensus that is happening. No question of it, where they're centralizing the dissipation of information under the guise of a threat through terrorists and all that kind of business. Oh yes, there will be terrorists, I'm not denying that, and there will be devils and so forth, and within every fruit pie, so to speak. But I'll tell you what a wonderful way to contrive what these things might be after. I'm talking about the Greys. What a wonderful way to do that than to create public enemy number one in terms of this thing or that thing or whatever. And instead of man finding joy in being diversified and wonderfully different, we conform to a terrible recipe, a recipe that actually might, in fact, take away our most precious quality of all as natural being, the ability that we can go on eternally. And again, the Christian teacher, I was reading something about this person's words about what he actually said. The only thing he ever promised was, in his own terms, he said, "Believe in me and I will give you eternal life." I'm puzzled about this. What is this thing? It's the only thing he actually promised. He said eternal life. And I think what he was trying to say now in the context of the Greys, and it's the only way you can, I think, really understand it if there's an element called the Greys, and that is quite simply, you can take away the propensity we all naturally have for eternal life if such a thing is here as a threat. And I think maybe this guy came to this planet not to form some terrible organizations called Roman Catholics or whatever Christian cartels that come together. He came to warn us of the great danger of all, something that threatens eternal life, our capacity for eternal life. And I can't see anything more powerful than that, than greys or roboids or synthetic being, and that can amalgamate with us. I don't want to get technical and talk about specifics and so on in my research, but maybe you'll forgive me if I just quote something I've got from the researchers to kind of justify.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Now, in the first Apocalypse of James, in the Nag Hammadi Codex, right? That's a new reference found by some.
The Nag Hammadi treaties found in Nag Hammadi.
I don't know if people are generally aware of this. A kind of reenactment or restatement of the biblical proposals and testaments, Old Testaments, New Testaments, found in some kind of situation in the Middle East. Now, the first Apocalypse of James, as written within these scrolls that were discovered, called the Nag Hammadi Codex, the Christian teacher, Jesus, explains to the apostle, James, how to cope with beings who take away souls by theft. What better description of abduction could there be than that? He goes on to tell James, when he also says to you, where will you go? You are to say to him, to a place from which I have come, there shall I return. And if you say things, you will escape their attacks. Thus, if James makes clear his own route of being to these creatures and shows them that he fully intends to return to the root, i.e., to where life and everything comes from, he will escape their attacks. Because you see, that proposal in this ancient text actually bears out what I've been saying, and I form my opinions based upon looking at these things and so on. Excuse me. Actually, you are telling a robot what it is, because I don't believe a robot can know what it is. It is a program. So when it realizes that it's just information, it will just take that in, and that's all. It won't act in revenge or, well, you know more than me and I know more than you and that kind of nonsense. Of course not. It's just information for a robot. And when you tell the robot what it is, within its schematic of understanding, it may well be able to understand that there's something it can never be. And that is enough to let a robot or whatever just let you go. And quite often, when you put out faith or belief or whatever, in some sense or form of knowing the authors of this, whether it's the Buddha in Buddhism or Jesus Christ in Christianity or Isaiah in the ancient prophetic system of Israel or whatever, and you face them with something like this, these things wonder what these schematics are, what this information is, and they will hang around to know more, so they will not end you or take you out. It's only if you hybridize them into a human form, both things, that the human form can have revenge, can have a sense of anger and so on, and the hybrid form will be a contrast, and then they become even worse than either of the two alternatives in terms of wickedness or evil. So hybrids are the forms that we have to look out for, it seems to me, and we better try to find out some way. If this is true, I'm not here again, I'm just contriving these, or looking at this and putting them together. If it is true, it's something I think we should tell everybody to look out for. Maybe this principle is going on. Do not believe what you read in the mainstream press. Most of it is contrived, regurgitated to a particular aegis. The internet is still relatively free. Search it, look there, and again, watch there, too, for those people intercepting it, trying to sell you extremism and all the rest of it. I would say that unequivocally to people. But just for the sake of your preciousness, your own individual glory of a living being, realize how rare you are. You might be in the whole universe. Of all those trillions of planets, life, I believe, is the rarest and most wondrous thing. Still delayed, if you see what I mean, from going back to the eternal frame of reference, the Godverse, but still there as little lights we call human beings or Oglanders or whatever, all hoping for some way, some rationale on the route they've established, coming to where they are, to go back into that first place we all come from. And I believe the great Christian teacher actually demonstrated this. And the latest and most exciting thing I've discovered is that this Christian teacher, with the artifact called the Shroud of Turin, I think demonstrated that this is still possible for all human beings when this wondrous thing glowed inside a shroud with a power equivalent to, they've worked out, scientists have now worked out, it would have taken 38,000 billion watts of energy to put this distance-coded information image on linen, as is seen in the Shroud of Turin, that this thing is utterly genuine, that the dating was all obscured and obfuscated, not deliberately perhaps, but by incidental ways it was carried out. And this wondrous thing, I think, bears relevance to what we all could be. And I believe that this great man, this great teacher came here to demonstrate that this was still possible from the earth when he transfigured and then when he later came back, so to speak, from the dead in the resurrection. And it's not magic. This is absolutely scientifically now proving to be the most intriguing thing of all, because you know, Rex, they cannot duplicate that kind of energy with modern machinery now. Never mind 2,000 years ago. How on earth did this fantastic thing, coded with a two-dimensional thing, coded with distance information, giving three-dimensional information, how could this happen as a perfect pathological double of a genuine human being killed and crucified? No question.
You feel, Nigel, that it was Jesus projecting himself into a light being again, basically going back to the source, and by going back to the source, it imprinted that on the shroud.
Absolutely. I'm very impressed with your ability to see things, Rex. I have to say that. I give you a compliment. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's a marvelous, marvelous thing for us all. And it's not wishful thinking. Here's evidence for it. I'm not a person for wishful thinking. My background is science. I came at this to disprove it. I have to be honest. I came at the whole business of UFOs to actually say to my son at the end, that was my wish. This is all nonsense. Please consider doing things worthy of your brain and don't get caught by all this nonsense. And instead of which I got trapped by it.
It's a good trap.
We are. It's a tender trap, shall we say, but it's nevertheless a trap.
You know, and you brought up the Nag Hammadi treatise also, and the secret book of John in that treatise is one of the most fascinating to me, and it does kind of bring up this whole synthetic versus natural universe when it discusses the archons and how basically they created Adam and Eve, and when they did so, they realized that Adam was greater than they were. But the way it describes it was, Yaldabaoth, this chief archon, basically breathes breath into Adam when he creates him, and by doing so, it took his essence, his power that he got from what they call the Mother Sophia, and this is all, you know, purely subjective in representation of just thinking about things in images, I guess, archetypal. But when it talks about basically the archons breathe air into Adam, and they realize at that moment that Adam is greater than they are, and they lost their power, it makes me wonder about this whole natural versus synthetic universe, and if some of these interpretations of fallen angels or demons could actually be synthetic archetypes of the actual source.
Well, you know, the whole point about it is that whatever these things are, they are realizing something in the Sophia of Jesus Christ, for instance. Jesus talks about molded beings who were condemned as robbers because they welcomed the blowing of the breath of God, but they were not able to receive the power for themselves, you know. And that is a very, very telling piece of information there. He then tells the apostle in no uncertain terms that he came to mankind, you know, to free him, to free mankind from these robbers who attempt, albeit in vain, that's a great thing, to steal soul from those to whom it rightly belongs. Amazing, absolutely amazing. And he says that he loosed the bonds of the robbers from immortal man and broke the gates of the pitiless ones before their faces. How wonderful that is. Could these bonds that are loosed, you know, I'm asking the question now, Rick, could these bonds that are loosed and the gates that are broken perhaps be the gates and bonds which interrupt the genome of mankind, blocking and holding dormant, dormant, but the full expression of the natural, unintercepted genetic scope of humanity? Jesus describes these robbers as the pitiless ones. Really telling, really incredible. And, of course, if you try to look at these kinds of texts now in the context of what we know about the atom and genetics and so on, it begins to show you something absolutely sensational. And you can understand why anyone looking at this, you have to be objective. I had to put away all I knew in science and religion, and I wasn't ever very religious, I have to say, but and from the science point of view, it was a very, very strong thing for me to actually put away the conventional in-the-box type of science. But that's about 95% of scientists in the box. They're very, you might think they have all these degrees, but they can't think for themselves in their own terms. They only derive things from other people. About 5% have that glorious out-of-the-box view with the in-the-box knowledge, but they can see that out-of-the-box within the box gives you a whole picture and not the partial picture of a load of measurers with, steel tapes and theodolites and so on, going and measuring everything in physical sentient terms. And to that end, I think that I'm a real admirer of the work of Rupert Sheldrake, a very, very eminent scientist who's been vilified by the common herd, so to speak. And that really is a lesson to me on how to diversify and not get stuck in a particular tenor of mind. It's not taking away the scientific ethics, the provability and so on. It just increases the range of your cursor and challenges you to bigger thought forms than a narrow wind in the willows or Mr. Mole type of pebble glass view of things right in front of you. And of course, they're the ones now believed. I mean, science is the new religion, we all know, and it was just as bad as the old ignorant religions and the ignorant interpretations of it, which we suffer from now in fundamentalism and so on. And of course, we need to be freed up, and look all the way around and see for ourselves. So please, I urge everyone, even in the books, do not take one thing I say to be gospel, or just check it out for yourself. We have a great means now at our disposal. I don't know how long that's going to be free, but they'll actually corral that too in time. I'm talking about the internet. I think anyone who really wants to answer the questions and really find out the power of their simple value as human beings, I don't think anybody should ever devalue themselves, no matter whether they've been a loser or haven't achieved. They still have this precious thing called life and are at least ostensibly capable of changing mind, which a synthetic, computerized being can never do.
Well, and you also talk a lot about, basically the media is controlled to where very little is discussed about true extraterrestrial phenomenon. You'll see a lot of clips and stuff about, you'll see UFOs you can kind of see, but there's really nothing ever super credible in the mainstream media. So yes, you've got the internet now, which you can get a pretty good amount of information out there, but even the internet is controlled by, the Department of Defense, and certain keywords and stuff will be taken out immediately. Certain websites that post information that they consider to be too damning for certain factions of the government, they'll DOS it to they'll get it shut down. They'll come up with a way to get it taken out. So it just kind of reminds me, and I'm sure many of our listeners, that this system in play is designed for control, and it's almost like a system of dark ecstasy at the top levels. These guys feed off of calling people terrorists that are really truth seekers, and yet they can feed people genetically modified foods that have all sorts of horrible chemicals in them that are far worse for you than driving without a seatbelt when you can get a ticket. Obviously not wearing your seatbelt, you can easily get a ticket, and if you don't pay that fine, then they can go after you with a warrant for your arrest. I'm just using hypotheticals here. It's phenomenal. So what do we do as just you and myself? How do we get out to the masses to say, quit feeding the beast that is controlling you, but actually help those that are trying to help you and your future generations?
That's the $64,000 question, and I feel ill-qualified. I feel ill-qualified to answer or give proposals on that as a fellow human being. I can only say, and I hope this is not some kind of contrived modesty. It's not. I really do believe this. I can only tell you, I really do believe this, and that is, there must be some mechanism within each of us that kind of inures us from whatever might be done in the context that you so eruditely just spoke of, and that is to realize that our thought and thinking perspective and the focus of our feelings and attitudes must have an overwhelming power some way. And I believe that the great teachers who came and sacrificed their lives in Jerusalem, for instance, if Christ was a fraud, the last place a con man would go after prophesying a terrible death would be into the gates of Jerusalem. Yet this guy, having said that they will crucify him and do all of this, still went in there and had the whole thing happen. He knew it was going to happen. Now, to me, that cannot be a con man. That a person who can go and suffer a thing like that may well have been telling the truth. And if he told the truth, then it's for us to find out what exactly he said and what that truth is. That, of course, has been obfuscated. We know by the Vatican, by the whatever Christian denomination takes their own purview of or interpretations of this. So it's very important, rather like the internet, not to look at contrived agencies that sell a particularized form of goods hidden as truth, but to look more in the factual sense of derivational science, right? And then look at that in terms of those people who have given us signs of plausibility, like I just cited for this Christian guy, Jesus Christ. And he seemed to me, I mean, he jumped off all the pages that I actually looked at and saw to be a wonderful example of why it is important to stay away from syntheticness against, naturalness. But what is it that does that? Now, I don't know about you, Rex, but I'm sure you were subjected to this good versus bad business, be a good boy and all that kind of business, and dad and mom, and right the way through we get this propaganda of goody is better than baddie, so to speak. But I was perverse enough a rat to say, why isn't baddie good? You see what I mean? You certainly have a lot of fun being bad rather than being bored with being schematically good, so to speak.
The supervillains have all the fun.
You bet, mate. And so we go on like this. And I thought to myself, hey, hang on. All of them are encouraging some disposition where you bring things together with your thinkability. In other words, if the universe has been smashed to pieces going the opposite way, breaking things up, then a full A4 sheet of paper is better together in its integrity as an A4 sheet of paper than if you tear it in half. It's more complex, you've got to do more work to get it back together again, if you see what I'm trying to say, than the full sheet of paper where all the information, so to speak, metaphorically, can be written. Now, I'm sorry, I hope people can follow that, I've got this visualization in mind, but, I have to hope that everybody kind of, comes at this and not some strange man from across in the UK spewing all these kind of, answers and ideas and so on. Anyway, the point is that straight piece of A4 sheet is all information together, and you know about A4 sheetness before it's broken in half. Once it's broken in half and you're in one of the two halves, you don't really know from one half to the other what A4-ness is, so to speak. And so it goes on breaking, so to speak, tiny, tiny pieces, and we end up on one of those tiny pieces, first wondering what the brick looked like from the grains of sand that made it. It's like us sitting on each grain of sand and trying to contemplate what brickness is all about, the whole thing together. If you see what I mean, looking back, as a metaphor, looking back. So I'm thinking to myself now, how best is this done? By a momentum of actually thinking and bringing and unionizing thoughtnesses. That could be described as good simply from a functional aegis, and anything that separates, tears up, breaks up could be seen as bad. So to me, God is simply bringing the whole thing together in all the information, and the devil or Satan or Lucifer, all the other things, or grays or whatever, is the complete opposite, the tearing it up and going with the devolution of a dissipating universe to the second law of thermodynamics. Very simple for me to understand that paradigm. So what does goody-goodiness mean? It translates, well, I don't like the word love used in any context except its special meaning. And to me, that is the ultimate sense of real, powerful focus possible to bring things together. So you can have the principle of love, be it with a human being, or building things together, constructs that build more constructs of togetherness and so on, in a broadly philosophical, behavioral, psychological, schematic, so to speak. And we can take that forward as the paradigm that somehow, maybe, actually allows our complex atomic structure as physical atomic beings with heavy, chemistry like molybdenum in us and lead in us. Now we require zinc to see things. We have been made heavier atomically. Maybe we can unravel that into lighter and lighter componencies, and the lightest of all would be hydrogen, would it not, if you're looking at it from a strictly chemical point of view, and that would be to kind of lighten up. Originally, it was light, then hydrogen gas, if you see what I'm trying to say, with the universe. So in that kind of way, maybe by thinking togetherness and being togetherness and acting and doing things of that, we are altering our atomic state too. Now, there is evidence to actually prove that this can be happening. actually science evidence, but it's too obscure and it's too cutting edge at the moment for me to even put it in my last book, the book I've just finished. But I hope maybe if I'm around to do that, in the future. But this will then point to the fact that being goody-goody may be the way that we return with that knowledge that we still have coming from, the origin, that we still have if we're living and free to think and not interfered with like they are doing, as you say, in internets and putting us in, polarizing us in smaller and smaller cartels. If we can do that, then maybe we have a chance of return. And through life and death and life and death and life and death, we might be able to gradually move closer and closer to that preeminence state described in the Nag Hammadi thing, where people talk about angels. I don't know about angels and stuff like that, but I must say that you could describe that as a state that we, in other words, to make angels of men, we can go back into that kind of a disposition and finally be, as Christ described us, gods. Don't ye know ye are gods? We are torn up godness, really, as physical human beings, but nevertheless godness, because we're still connected. All those little carry bits are all connected back because we come to a derivational line, mom, grandma, granddad, great-granddad, great-grandma, and so on, all the way back. And that's the great way that I connect this whole thing up and say, think like that, be like that. And maybe when your field goes out of a physical form into a non-physical situation, maybe made of tachyons or whatever they call this, a tachyon being, maybe the ghosts and dead are something like this. Again, I'm speculating, and I don't want to host the letters asking me and telling me that, well,
I need to interrupt here real quick. I'm
yeah.
sorry, but you brought up a really good point, and this is one thing that I should have asked you earlier. A lot of people that get abducted multiple times claim that they also have a lot of paranormal activity around them. They'll see shadow people, ghosts, they'll have more psychic senses. I've talked to other people. The other day, we interviewed a guy by the name of Bill Bean, which has a pretty incredible testimony. When he was a child, the house that he lived in was haunted horrifically, according to him. He wrote a book about it, and the book was basically put together in a series of hauntings on the Discovery Channel, I think. Anyway, one of the pictures that he took when he was, it was actually a picture of his mom at the house that was very haunted. She was just doing her nails or something. In the background, you could see a mirror. And in the mirror, I'm telling you, man, this is one of the scariest pictures I've ever seen. It looked like a giant gray, the head, just the head. And
Yes.
It's a picture from the 60s. I mean, it should have been her reflection there or something, but no, there was just this gray staring at her. And I'm telling you, man, it was pretty frightening.
Well, if by that you're surmising that these things can work on the edge of atoms and can actually intercept their being there when we're dead in the scope of what I call our soul fields and get information at that point into an individual, they may well have the technology to actually work at that level. But once you get closer and closer by this unionizing process to the Godverse, then you're out of their range. And sometimes they're actually seen in what I call the rooms of death. I mean, I can't. I'll be talking for another 10 hours if I went to explain that on air now. But I will say this to you. I've written it about that in my third book. Again, I don't want to advertise my book or anything. I just want to say to you that if you think about it, yes, we all survive death. That I am fundamentally convinced of. I wasn't when I started looking at this, that we survive death, but I'm fundamentally convinced of that is a root on which we all stand. We do survive death. How we survive it, where we survive it, that's the big deal. How do we speculate on that and so on? And Rex, this is the most interesting thing of all. If these guys can be operating at a situation where they might in fact be able to download information or hack into us easier when we die, then it could explain why so much is brought about so that so many people die so meaninglessly on this world. And they are really contriving situations where wars are caused, where conflicts are caused, where tragedies are caused, and so on. So they may intercept certain suitable types of soul. Paranormal activity around abductees can be the result of their technology affecting the curtain between life and death. That's possible. I don't know how to prove that. I really, again, have to speculate that, but it's an idea that I would say is plausible and in my own terms have sympathy in terms of looking at, if you see what I mean. So there's this skull experiment that was done that actually see these things. And of course, these psychics are absolutely stunned to see these grey type entities where previously they saw ghosts and human surviving soul field, or what I call morphogenic electrospatial fields. In other words, the continuum on which each individual takes all that individual's information on past death into another situation of existence, if you see what I mean. And I'll tell you what, Jesus said one of the famous writers, William Shakespeare, said there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Well, there you go. You've got this situation where all this comes together within the mind frame of men. But now, of course, seeing these things flying in the sky and all that kind of business and being able to measure it and look at it atomically and so on, we have a far greater chance of actually seeing the full picture. And I hope maybe I will add a small addendum to that full picture. And I hope that others will take this on, better minds than mine, greater minds than my perception, have a look at it, and maybe future generations might provide some source to stop what is happening in our world now with all the carnage you see going on. Everyone thinks because there are no world wars, things are getting better. But if you look at the details of what is happening in conflicts around the world and the terrors that people go through, you will find that point to point, pro rata, things have not improved at all. We'll still go on with this terrible diversification of the thinkability of our togetherness as a human family. We keep on finding excuses to separate ourselves. Now the great enemy is Islam, because parts of Islam have made themselves deservedly into that enemy. I'm not saying, but the vast majority, if you look at Islam in its own terms, I believe it's a beautiful ethos as promulgated by their prophet. And so you get that kind of thing. And the Christians had this with all the terrible things they did in terms of the wickedness through the centuries to everything, colonialism, all of those evils may be methodologies to produce a fund of morphogenic fields for these things to tap into as and when it suits them. So maybe the greys and artificial light forms are, in fact, with their technology and their advanced kind of intelligence, able to see how to control us as a factor for their use. And that's what I'm looking at. What is the hidden agenda? What is in it for them? And the answer I've come down to with all that we've looked at so far is that it has to be a propensity we have got that they don't have. And the biggest propensity there, I believe, is a thing called a soul.
And they're certainly trying to get it, it seems. Ladies and gentlemen, check us out, www.disclosuremedia.net. You can also check out Nigel's work at nigelkerner.com. He's got some great books. You can also get them on Amazon, but you can go through his website also. And one of the things that fascinates me we were talking earlier, Nigel, about microchipping and synthetic Google. You've got Ray Kurzweil. He is boasting the transhuman movement more than anybody. He's one of the leading figureheads. He's talked about the singularity. By the year 2025, man will be obsolete in his eyes because machine will be so powerful that machines will be creating machines that will be thinking faster than humans before they can blink an eye, basically, is what he has said in a nutshell. So he is now one of the leading directors for Google, and they make very popular.
The greatest antidote to Kurzweil is that somebody actually loves him and is very warm and kind to him and gives him one great big hug every single moment in his life. And then let's see how much of a machine he can be.
Well, it's just, I find it interesting that one of the most popular phones out there now is called the Droid. It's one of the more popular phones out there is the Android operating system. It's all part of Google. You look at people now walking across the street, they're looking on their phones as they walk across the street. If you see people at coffee, everybody's looking on their phones. So it's as if the more integrated we get, the more connected we get, the more we disassociate ourselves with our friends, our neighbors. People are going up now constantly on the computer, on their phone, playing a video game, and they just don't even go outside anymore. Do you feel that this Agenda 21, this New World Order agenda to usher in everything to all be consolidated and underneath one roof, one umbrella, is at the top levels controlled by this synthetic entity or these synthetic entities?
Well, I think, from your own words, as long as there are people who say what you just said the way you said it in this world, it'll be much harder for these rascals to do that.
I hope so.
So I have to say that I feel that coming from you, and then hopefully there will be millions and millions of people who have a sense of this awesome danger. And all I can say, Rex, is for heaven's sake, what can we do? We can only promulgate answers by fairly well thought out conditions and so forth, and put that together in some kind of drapery that people can understand and look at, and hope that they will get this information. I don't know whether my next book will ever be published because it is so controversial. I don't think, if it's been controlled by, by just 6 corporations or cartels that disseminate information in this world, it stands a bat's chance in hell. But
Hey,
that
can
doesn't.
you give us a taste?
I'm sorry, I didn't get.
I said, can you give us a taste? A little teaser of the book you're wanting to put together that you don't think will get published?
Well, I mean, the point is, I don't know. The publishers, my present publishers, usually give it the titles. In fact, the last title of my second book in the series, Grey Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls, was not my title. That was obviously done by the department, who thought it would sell more copies. I had a different title to that. So I really don't know what, my idea of calling the next book will be The Margins of Forever. Now, that might be too ephemeral and too airy-fairy for a hard-nosed publisher, I don't know, but I will fight for it as much as I can. And who knows, Rex, with most people who try these things, I'm sure there are thousands and thousands of writers who can write this much better than I can and see this much clearer than I can. I really do mean that. But the point is that they have to get that opportunity and that presumption and that ability to be able to reach those that might kind of factorize it in that way and present it to all the children of the world. My own ethos is, without sounding too sentimental, it's really for the future. I mean, I'm now at a stage where, the lights are winking and we might be bye-bye, some other place, and maybe I can test my theories there. But the point is I'm looking at my son and my grandchildren and so forth, and I would say to you, well, let's hope that something is left in them that might, kind of, without sounding too kind of maudling about it, let me say my new book will be an attempt to explain how ordinary human beings can fight the scenario of transhumanism that is being, put forward now. And that is a very strong component of it. What the anti-Kurzweilian type of ethos, which so many people, I fear, in their billions will buy into.
Well, I don't know if you knew this or not. Well, I had the opportunity to interview somebody by the name of Aaron Franz a few years ago, which wrote a pretty good book on transhumanism. And shortly after the 2001 9/11 attacks, there was a lot of the prominent organizations around the world and corporations and governments got together and actually discussed transhumanism, the future of human. And for anybody that's pro-transhumanism, one of their ultimate agendas is to completely eliminate any type of sexual desire from man and woman, so that they will take that out of their life completely, so that they'll have more time to think about stuff that is what they call more important. So yeah, basically cut and dice, take away the emotions of human. I'm sure you've heard of the fun vaccine that the Pentagon developed that's designed to eliminate the God gene, or the part of the brain that is what you could consider faith-based. What gives you faith and belief in a higher power.
Yes.
So yeah,
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, the great selling point is going to be, look, life's going to be far better when you don't think about it, and we do your thinking for you.
Yeah, let us do the thinking for you. Let us plug a microchip in you and decide what you're going to do with your life. That's much better for them.
Absolutely. And that way, what's that actually mean? It's control in capital letters. And there you are. That's a very simple adjunct to all of this. And how on earth does the ordinary punter, so to speak, out there, go out there and say, no, I don't want that. I have this sense, of coming through billions of years and so forth, to be converted into a piece of stone, written in stone. Well, you've got to show them what the plausible scenario for returning from that status might be, and not inevitably being pushed into it as though there is no alternative. And that's going to be the hard sell. There will be no alternative. You might as well now get chipped, You might as well now tell us where you are, who you are, how you are every second of the day, so that we can control your lives and do what's good for you because we think that is better. And usually the people that will do that will be a higher form of synthetic being that hasn't the faintest idea that there does exist a universe beyond atoms that I call the Godverse, where all things come together in a single whole, timelessly, where all things are known and all continuity is there implicitly forever. And that kind of thing, you might say, well, I can't conceive of that. I can only conceive of time moving spatially and in a linear fashion, and that's what happens, and that's really what I am, and I don't need anything else. Well, 1 second after you die, you might just think different, but it may be too late to contrive a situation where that's possible for you. And so therefore, being together with each other, caring, not harming each other, but being as different as possible, respecting each other's space, that kind of thing, which sounds wonderful, doesn't it? In behavioral psychology, that is supposed to be the anthem of all anthems, and this is how we are supposed to aim at trying to get situations together that we all form a kinship for each other's benefit in multiples, so to speak. I'm sorry I'm prattling on here way past the time, but you know, it gets interesting when you talk, doesn't it really?
Oh, hey, this is great. I really appreciate you spending a few more minutes with us here past the 2 hours. We could probably go another 2, but it's 6:30 in the morning where you're at.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, very, very much for the privilege of being able to talk to you. And it has been a privilege, may I say, Rex. You're one of the really understanding guys out there that actually wants to take things to where perhaps we don't want to go, you know, so to speak.
Well, I really appreciate that, Nigel. It was an absolute blessing to speak with you. Our listeners were enthralled. I'd like to thank the chantyproject.com. You guys have some great information on your website also. Ladies and gentlemen, please check out Nigel's work, nigelkerner.com. And Nigel, hopefully we'll have the opportunity to speak again with you sometime. I
would love to do that. Absolutely love to do that. And I give your family and all your friends my blessings and my best feelings. God bless you both.
Same here.
Mom,
thank you very much.
Mom, Dad, wife, whoever.
Thank you so much. You take care,
Bye.
Nigel. You take care.
Bye.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You have a fantastic evening. Hope to talk to you again soon.
A very special thank you to our guest tonight. For all of you that had the opportunity to be here with us, if you enjoyed the show, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, for the most recent interviews, videos, and podcasts. Or you can check us out on the World Wide Web, www.leeproject.com. Would you like to be a guest on our show? If you have information that the world needs to see and hear, send us an email, guestbookings@leakproject.com. Thank you, everybody. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night. The board and free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear hosting Leak Project. The Leak Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leak Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain drain media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth.
Tonight's guest is Nigel Kerner, an author and freelance journalist. He was born in Sri Lanka, his mother from a British planting family, and his father an officer in the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Army. This international family base provided the background for an obsessive and serious interest in international human affairs and how these interfere with science, religion, and philosophy. He has felt driven from his young years to expose the humbug and hypocrisy in modern scientific and religious and social thinking. His formal graduate education is in biomedical science and human behavioral psychology. He has written 2 very compelling books on the subject of the infamous Greys, one called The Song of the Greys, another one, Grey Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls. Nigel, thank you very much for getting up very early where you're at in the UK. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, fair enough. It's a wonderful morning if I can just about see the sun coming up. And
Nice.
I have to say I'm delighted to be with you in America.
Wonderful. We're all very glad to have you on the show. We've got a lot of listeners right now. They're excited to hear your theories on, these infamous Greys. The first book you put together, I think it was in the late 90s, called The Song of the Greys, and most recently you put one together called Grey Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls. I'm just going to jump right out. Really what led you into this field of research?
Oh, well, it was quite incidental. In my case, I wasn't kind of driven by a special ethos to particularly change perspectives of anyone and whatever. I was just leading my life along the usual lines of most people, I suppose. And then families come along as you go on. And in this particular case, it was my 12-year-old son who prompted a completely and devastating change in the perspective in my life. And that was when he simply asked a question that a child would ask a father, are these aliens true? In his case, the quote was, Dad, are flying saucers true? Now, I want to put this in this kind of perspective, and I hope I don't bore your audience, but actually it illustrates the natural kind of innocence of how I stumbled into a Pandora's box that has devastated my own psychology over the last 50 years or so. I've always had an interest in things that actually are outside the box, so to speak. I never had this penchant for looking at things in a conventional way. I always had to come at it from different angles and so on. And I was probably a very great bore to more conventional teachers and whatever it is through my life and so on. But it's been a natural thing with me to actually look at things in that kind of perspective. And I suppose you could describe me as a kind of perverse rat, not going through the conventions that everybody else does for a peaceful life. So when my son at 12 years old asked me, are these UFOs true? My first temptation was to say to him, and I said it in a lot of interviews, but it's very relevant because it's a point at which a catharsis took place for the FAR. Of course, I was aware of all the, space adjuncts like Star Wars and Buck Rogers and Superman and all that kind of business and so forth, as we all were, I suppose. And this took me on to a kind of serious look at it because that guy, that 12-year-old guy had something between his ears, and he often used to ask me a question, the answer or the ignorant answer of which would actually imply that I knew absolutely nothing, and I wasn't going to fall for this particular trick or canard of his, as he usually used to play games with me, and ask a question he jolly well knew the answer to, and I had no clue about, and embarrassed me in front of my friends. And I said to him, look, I don't know the answer to your question, to be honest. I can't see, from what I understand of science at the time, that these things are actually, true or verified. He was asking about UFOs to see if they were actually real. And his question really was, Dad, are UFOs real, to put it precisely? So I said about the whole business of having a look at this, and I said, I'll come back to you in a week. Give me a rain check on that. I'll come back to you in a week, and I'll give you what I think it is. That actually got me out of a bind, and I went ahead and had a look and searched around for what information I could get. And remember, this was before the days of the internet, where a tiny push on a button can reveal the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, if you see what I'm trying to say to people. And so it was a bit of a kind of effort, and I did make the effort a little bit to give my son a responsible answer. I kind of took my job as a dad seriously, as most dads do. Anyway. And the more I looked at it, I found that a day, a week, a month, and even years weren't adequate to actually answer this question as completely as it has to be answered, if you see what I'm trying to say. And I went into this as deeply as I possibly could, and each time I turned the page, so to speak, there were another 10 pages, and there were another 10 questions, and there were another intriguing insights, and rather collection of insights to face, and so forth. And I still haven't properly been able to give that son of mine, who's now in his 40s, a cogent answer, although I think he himself has arrived at his own conclusions. And so, you see, I just wanted to stress, Rex, the natural and uncontrived incidentality of the situation. It was a just daddy son thing, really, basically, to start with. And I suppose there's a lot of romance in that, in that sense. And I suppose it was nice that I had to actually alter the complete platform of my existential ideas based upon looking at this phenomenon we call UFOs and what they actually might be.
Oh, and with that research that you have put together, and what did that change your perspective? Before, did you just not even think about it, or did you think, yeah, they're probably out there, they're most likely just space beings that, just like us, they were evolved into a certain level, or did you really have an opinion at that point?
No, I had no opinion at all about this particular type of adjunct in our lives, shall we say. I had no idea about UFOs out there and so forth. Although one had actually read things about Roswell and so on, one looks at that in terms of the schematic of the 50s and the 60s when there was a Cold War, and one actually kind of, settled into ideas that it might be some kind of mischief on either side in terms of vehicles and passing in the night or across the skies or whatever. And I suppose there's that loose sense that we all had about things like this. There was never any sharp focus on it. But the thing that really turned me over was as I went into this and the Pandora's box actually opened a little bit more, and I looked into what was there, I began to see that UFOs were not, in perspective terms, anything to do, really, in their full meaning, with things that flew across at speed in the sky at 30,000 miles an hour, turning at right angles. It was far more to do with the basic existentiality of our very, very meaning as beings and people and intelligent entities that can perceive and understand things through meaning, so to speak, It was a very, very powerful and deep, if you like, knitting needle that went in to the morass of confusion and so forth, and was, in some instances, able to isolate a line of the thread that you could actually follow and connect up the dots, so to speak, as we went along. And that's what began to intrigue me. Hang on a minute, this is connected with so many other things, and each new, as I said, page as I turned it, provided a whole encyclopedia of new pages to look at. And I was really interested in the existential base of it all. I wasn't interested in UFOs as such, to answer your question. I wanted to know, who the hell are we? How did this huge universe arrive from no thingness, if you see what I'm trying to say, from a point so small you can't even conceive it? Just what does extent and space mean in that context? How does all this solidness out there appear from a point that is supposed to be an explosion, albeit a quiet one? Most people don't realize, there was no noise to this explosion, so to speak. If you think about it and go into the quantum areas of physics and so on, that's something that might be intriguing for people who aren't specialized in the scientific outlook of things and so on. But this wonderful bursting, or whatever it might have been, caused an actuality to be. And then, I'm sorry, it seems like a monologue talking to all your audience, but I'm trying to keep it consistent so people could kind of follow my thinking in a way.
Right.
But this then would lead to one big conundrum, Rex. And that conundrum is this: if it burst out, and we know that everything every day doesn't persist, it breaks up, rots, it all dies, how do we get coherence that allows us a sense of feeling that is more than just dying, than dissipation? And of course that is governed, as anyone who's done, I suppose, school physics knows, by the second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything goes from a state of chaos, increasing chaos, into randomness with time, and nothing goes the other way. So if we're in a singular momentum from that burst, that original burst, and everything is dissipating and breaking up into greater states of disorder, how on earth do we know that? How are we here to understand that? What is there that presumes that state of physical breakup in atomness such that we can see this? Now that incredible thought sent me my head spinning, and I kind of, concentrated on that for the rest of my life, so to speak, trying to arrive piecemeal at the answers. And I don't claim to be anything else than a curious individual looking, contriving the evidence into a situation where others can look, and then setting it down and saying, hey, take a look at this. What do you think of this? This is what it means to me, but do you have your own ideas? And actually giving a person the chance to do that away from our everyday lives and the things we do might put a person far more in touch, in more depth of their own selves than just following the day's own troubles, event to event, so to speak.
With the possibility of, obviously, we're all connected at some point, the quantum entanglement theory, yet there's this big bang, so we all expand, but we're all part of the same consciousness, and you get into this possibility of the holographic universe theory, where there's really no finite matter. Everything's somewhat holographic in a sense. It's like empty space. You can't get to that finite point. So you talk in the book, I think, a little bit about, pre-space and then after, and then there's this phenomenon with the grays and different extraterrestrial races. I think that your theory, which is a very good plausibility, is that these grays that are amongst us now, and abductions or possibly abductions, are somewhat of a synthetic being. And that reminds me of, if you get into the Nag Hammadi treaties, the archons, which were supposedly synthetic entities that created Adam and Eve. It's just a completely different theory. So I'm wondering if all this connects at some primordial level. And now that we've gotten really deep into the universe and pre-universe and now in the Big Bang and everything, how does that interconnect with the grays per se?
Yeah, obviously a highly perceptive, intelligent question you asked there. But you see, if everything's breaking up, Rex, one has to ask the question. And it's a really powerful question. There had to be something that presumed this breaking up, that was before this breaking up, that is still here, looking at the fact that things are breaking up, or can indeed look, is capable of looking at this particular thing. And that's the intriguing thing to me. That mind, thought, thinkingness, consciousness, whatever labels you give it, there was some kind of facility that had to presume or pre-exist this particular situation, where we become more and more confined and less broad in aspect and capabilities and of understanding and so on. And that leads us to the presumption of two things, and that two basic situations, and that is, if there is that natural connectability that presumes what I just said, there has to be what is natural, and I use the word natural, and there has to be something that changes naturality out of itself into another stage of presentation, and I would call that syntheticness. So from naturalness, that's the presumed thing before the universe, in the making of the actual physical universe, we are getting into a situation where naturalness is conforming or changing into another aspect of its presentation with time. And that aspect is being caused because things are getting more chaotic, not coherent, more chaotic with time. And that situation then defines for me two basic situations, naturalness and artificialness or syntheticness. And when naturalness creates out of itself artificialness and syntheticness, and that syntheticness then can dominate naturalness, we've got a situation that exists between human, living, natural, intelligent being, and shall we say, a roboid, an artificially intelligent, unnatural expression that comes out of the creative power of naturalness. The problem is, how do we get the line that interfaces between the two accurate enough to see how the two stand together, and whether one, in terms of the breaking up of the universe, remember that's dominating all the time and going on all the time, one can overwhelm the other. So is naturalness naturally being overwhelmed by artificialness through the second law of thermodynamics? which I tell you would be a huge disadvantage to whatever can be connected to that first point that came from the universe and thus called natural. That's what I say, that we as living existentialities, points of being, right, shall we say, if you look at our human nature, look, and let me say, this business of just we are the only ones in the universe, you would have to be someone looking up, shall we say, your rear end. Excuse me.
You have to have a very ignorant perception on things, that's for sure.
Absolutely. When you see all the multi-trillions of worlds out there, that there is a so-called singular God who usually is painted to be, Euro-Caucasian, shall we say, with a white flowing beard touching Adam's